FlexTrack is the platform that guides the healthy collaboration of red and blue teams to get the daily security work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Blue teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits through simple visualizations of risk, scanner, and ticketing integrations. Enhanced analytics allow you to effectively communicate risk in real time. FlexTrack is perfect for remote collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/FlexTrack to claim your free month today. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. A couple quick announcements. Join us at InfoSec World, a fully virtual event. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off. You can visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020 to get that discount code. Also, join our Security Weekly mailing list by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. Click the join button, and we are starting to roll out our public Discord channel slowly to various means as well. Our mailing list being the first one to make sure we got everything right. We wanted to phase that rollout. So if you're on a mailing list, you get things like that first, as well as announcements about all of our webcasts and virtual training. Mick Douglas, I believe, is still with us. Going to hang out for the news.
Yes, sir.
Sweet. Fantastic. I wanted to start out with, I think, one of the most hilarious quotes that I read this week about the I Love You virus. I don't know if you folks saw this, but they tracked down the author of the I Love You virus, which I believe statutes of limitations has passed, as well as he's from the Philippines, and there was no laws on the books in the Philippines about this sort of activity when this I Love You virus was released 20 years ago, I believe, is the 20-year anniversary. Are we celebrating that? Recognizing that? I don't know if celebration is really what it warrants, but for many of us who were probably like
it's a love fest,
right? Doing security or sysadmin work during that time when it spread to many of millions of hosts, which was most of the hosts on the internet at the time. But the quote that I think is really awesome is that the author says he created a title for the email attachment that would have global appeal. And his aim was really to collect, was nefarious, but he wanted to collect usernames and passwords of online services, right? Because back then, internet was expensive. It was largely dial-up and things like that. Especially in many countries across the world, such as the Philippines, that may not have had the infrastructure that we have in other countries. So he's looking to basically get free internet access. And who doesn't want free and open internet access? But he says, the title was basically to tempt people across the world to open it. And he says, and I quote, "I figured out that many people want a boyfriend. They want each other. They want love, so I called it that." That was just a prolific quote from the author of the I Love You virus. I love it.
Well, I mean, he delivered the love.
He did. Many people
says the man looking for a boyfriend.
Looking for a boyfriend.
Wait, what?
I mean, I'm not judging.
Wait, what? I am not looking for a boyfriend.
I'm not either. I mean, I've had Larry for 15 years, and it's great, and so therefore I haven't been looking since then. But
Larry's my main man.
Touche.
My main man.
Oh, and it's a really cool article. You should read it because there were a few journalists. The article that I read from the Schneider article links to 3 other articles. The one I read was from the BBC. It was very well written and researched. And they tracked down the author of the I Love You virus. So
nice.
Did any of you remember that? It was the Melissa virus before that, right? And then it was the I Love You virus.
Yeah.
Because there were a bunch of Melissas that were getting pissed off.
Right. Just like Karens are getting pissed off today.
There's equal opportunity offense is the way I put it. If you're not offended yet, you're going to be.
I tell you what, though, in terms of solidifying the position of information security professionals back then and certainly today, those email-borne viruses such as Melissa and ILOVEYOU in the early days really kind of solidified our positions in many organizations and consulting firms as making people realize that there are real threats out there. Now, there are much more real threats in different senses of the word over the past 20 years and certainly today. But it was those early viruses that were made people pay attention to security, and those that were doing security back then, which may not have carried the title security. So
that's true. I mean, it's pretty important to the survival and growth of the industry, not necessarily in that order. We need to continue to remind people that we are a really important function in the industry. I think, personally, from my perspective, doing the work at Black Hills, I think it's working. That we are successful in reminding people that what we do is really important and has a tremendous amount of value. But it is easy, unfortunately, for a lot of customers, a lot of people in the industry to grow complacent in the face of, lots of really good communication and marketing from people that say, don't worry, this stuff is safe, and it's not always safe.
Yeah, and we like to think that we can try and keep things safe, right? And it's unfortunate that I think largely in the past this was more common that we relied on some of these big incidents. And just to put that in context, right, I was working at the lottery company around that time. I wasn't involved in the Windows or email-based security. I was more on the Unix side of security. But when it came time for us to have a security audit, I think because of some of these large incidents that happened largely in email-borne viruses targeted at Windows Outlook users had run through, executives took those other security audits for things like Unix systems way more seriously because they understood the impacts. And I think what we've always struggled with in security is allowing people to understand the impacts without an incident, right? It's super hard for us as human beings to understand the impact of a virus, whether it's email-borne or whether it's in the air as we're experiencing now, until we've actually gone through it. And I think that's just human nature.
That's the job of the offensive or the pen test, the pen test community, right? If we're doing our job right, we're making companies better and really working with the blue team to build a more secure world. But often that has to come at the cost of providing and showing impact, whether that's a return on investment for a purchase, whether that's getting buy-in from upper management, whether that's demonstrating the risk in order to have a business entity or unit realize something that is not understood well. That's where we really should be doing our best job. And if we're doing it right, that's what we demonstrate. Yeah,
and it walks a fine line of fear, right? And we don't necessarily like or want to use fear as a motivator. I think by example, we need to work on facts and describing the impact without relying on fear, right? Because fear is
the analytical side of it, right?
Right, and because fear kind of speaks to panic and other things, but it's just not a healthy way to basically describe that risk in those kind of factors. So
it's not, but one of the things that makes me really upset that's been a trend in the last couple of years now is these Hollywood vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a logo. Yo, did you see that logo? The heart was bleeding.
And the theme song.
And then the theme song and the website, right? And the dance that goes with it. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, we've got some examples of those sorts of things, right? There's a new botnet targeting IoT devices over SSH. Lee, you had that article. And there's also...
We didn't call that 4 weeks ago, did we?
Yeah, exactly. But, there's also, the other stories we cover too, which sometimes I think come to fruition, but certainly could err on that side of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Are new malware jumps air-gapped devices by turning power supplies into speakers, right? And like we've covered at least a dozen or more of these vulnerabilities over the years. They come out fairly regularly. It's usually by a university research group or some other type of research group that is able to exfiltrate data based on the radiation from CRT monitors and spinning fans at different speeds and using lights to, I mean, we could go on, right, through history, and this is just the kind of latest thing. I think that the number of times we've seen this type of exfiltration of data, even though we've raised awareness about it, is still pretty low, right? I think I kind of turn to things like Stuxnet and other similar kinds of espionage and malware that use more very physical and tried and true. Like basically, they turned it over to the CIA to get the malware in. That to me is more reliable than relying on some of these other like bending of physics ways to get malware in and exfiltrate data, right? I don't know where you guys fall on this, but I guess I'm more of a realist when it comes to this type of malware jumping air gaps and things of that nature that relies on these things that really are not that reliable. Yeah. Tyler, I want your opinion on this. Kind of, I look to you as our expert on some of those areas of like really innovative ways of exfiltrating data and jumping air gaps, right? Like,
I mean, you have to distinguish the two. There's always an interesting, I think, disparity between interesting research that could be possible and maybe there's nation state using something similar or kind of the theory behind it. But why go through all that when you can pay off a Pakistani dude to give him a jump drive and plug it in and bypass something?
Yeah,
like I feel like there's a lot more real world use case where the easy way in, the common way in, they're not going to go burn a 0-day unless it's very specifically targeted for a very specific operation that's had time and proven value. They're not going to go burn it and not have a plan and not be set up to do it right. So really that kind of long-term game has to be thought about. And then the novelty of exfil like data via all these channels, that is probably happening in some cases, but for the most part, you can still do the tried and true simple ways. It's really the attribution piece that kind of gets a little bit sketchy where you have to ensure however you're attributing stuff or misattributing things, it's not causing some sort of long-term strategy error that will cause problems. So
what's interesting to me, and I've stated before, I'm reading the book Countdown to 0-Day, right, by Kim Setter, and it's not so much that the exfiltration was important because sometimes, and I never really considered this in the context of malware, that the exfiltration is really maybe you're reading news reports or you have insiders that are giving you information about the results, and that's your exfiltration, right? Because if you really don't care about the data, in the case of Stuxnet, right, it wasn't about the data. It was about the data was really how much damage was being caused. If you could glean that from insiders or espionage and or the news that was being released, then it didn't matter if you were using power supplies and alternating voltages, right, to get the data. That was kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, standard out via media.
Yeah, yeah.
It's pretty common, and honestly, like even the things that, if they are exfilling in that way in order for very specific targets or goals, then you're not going to be seeing those particular pieces. They're going to have protocols in place that are going to be reading between the lines via normal communication channels that blend in that aren't going to get caught.
Yep. Like
just like you go back to the one-time pad stuff where stuff gets printed in a particular newspaper in a certain way, like that stuff still happens.
Right.
It just happens at the digital level.
Steganography is big in terms of exfil, right?
So when you say steganography, that's kind of tricky because one of the things that has been seen and not very widely disseminated is steganography via images, maybe not stuff in the images, but a correlating key list. Like this Twitter account and this botnet of Twitter bots is posting this food picture that says this particular word. That food picture correlates to this particular thing. This other bot responds in a certain way via, that food looks amazing. They've got all this AI built around particular images, and there's a database of 5 million images, and each of these correlate to different aspects of something that's been pre-planned.
That's amazing.
Now you're talking about how steganography works.
It's like a network of steganography, right?
Yes.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I'm curious, the pen testers, Larry, Mick, and Joff too, right? In Tyler, like how many times have you had to use, like what's the most advanced method you've had to use to exfil data? Like normally I would imagine SSL probably works just fine, right?
I was going to say straight up SSL. That's actually not where
FTP, TFTP,
right?
Come on,
DNS.
That's actually not where the issue is, right? Because there's plenty of opportunities to exfil once you have a foothold, once you have the position in the industry, whatever you're targeting, right? The position in the organization. The issue, and I was actually discussing this with John today at significant length, is the endpoint defense industry has gotten really, really good lately. Mm-hmm. And the real issue has been, honestly, landing the initial C2 channel has become extraordinarily difficult. And I credit, and I am giving a shout out right now to many of the endpoint defense vendors for doing a great job in terms of both their static signatures, their API call and heuristic detection, their network-based heuristic detection. You guys are doing it, right? You're making us work really hard. That first step of establishing the C2 channel is getting thwarted a tremendous amount of time right now, and it is making us think creatively. And it is a significant impediment, to be honest, because we have to get that channel.
Yeah, that initial C2 access is always really, really difficult. And to blend in now is getting even more difficult.
It's become really difficult. Doesn't work. And so we should, part of me wants to cry, right? But the other part of me is we should celebrate this because there has been some defensive success that is significant on the traditional endpoints. And when I say traditional, I'm mostly thinking that the Windows domain joined kind of endpoints right now. Mm-hmm. But I also issue a warning to the vendors that you've ratcheted up the defense enough that we will pivot over towards the cloud. And as we do that, watch out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Joff, I'd also argue that it's now become a game of whack-a-mole in that they've upped their game. So now we will up our game, and then they'll up their game, and they'll find all the things that we were doing new, and then it's going to keep going. Because
technically, that's cat and mouse, not whack-a-mole.
Either way.
There has been a shift in the last few years. It's always been a game of whack-a-mole, right? The pen testing industry, to some extent, up until about 6 or 7 years ago, was largely exempt from the whack-a-mole game. We are no longer exempt. We are now in the whack-a-mole game. And so, given the fact that we are in the whack-a-mole game, how do we play is one question.
Don't get hit.
Do we choose potentially not to play? Do we make some sort of agreement with vendors? I don't know. We've gotten ourselves into an interesting position, and I think I hold some of us accountable. Frankly, I mean, I think some of the things that Black Hills has done, I think some of the things that the higher end industry companies have done, that Black Hills is not alone, Trusted Sec, and Guardians, and so on. We challenged some people to raise the game. They've raised the game. Okay, so now what do we do? Right?
We
They
also
called our bluff.
They called our bluff, right? Exactly.
They're like, oh, you're going to use all those techniques. Well, guess what? We're going to pay attention to them, and we're going to find out ways to stop them. Whereas, like you said, Joff, like I feel like 5 or 6 years ago, they were kind of blind to that and more focused on average everyday malware. That's the stuff we're going to try and stop. Exactly. And then I think when they got really good at that, they were like, what are all these advanced people doing? Oh, by the way, they're talking about them at conferences, on podcasts and presentations and webinars. Let's pay attention to that. And now they've ratcheted up their game. And so, like, now where do the attackers, everyday malware, nation-state attackers, and pen testers go? It's going to go somewhere else. They're not. None of those groups are going to give up and be like, oh, well, endpoint security is good, so we can't hack into systems, right? That's not how the game works.
We're all going to have to pivot now. Not literally, but sort of
literally and figuratively.
Figuratively.
Change your focus.
And so, okay. We sort of played the phase out. I'm a little concerned, and I can't really express it very well now because I do think
drinking
because of booze. Yes, Jeff.
Yeah, well, there's that, but I do think the penetration testing industry has a legitimate position in illustrating risk. But if we are thwarted from illustrating risk by the defense industry, is that good or bad? That's where I'm really torn, right? It's should we have some sort of exemption in there or should we not?
Well, that's interesting, Joff. It feels like we're at another crossroads, right? Because John and I, Strand and I, were at this crossroads, 10 plus years ago, where we were like, yeah, look, like there's a lot of ways you could stop us from getting in, but like if we try hard enough, we're going to get in. So let's just assume we're in, and then let's conduct the test. And then it was like basically like game over. There was very little that could stop us for basically 10 years, right? Now, I think it is encouraging to your point. Now we're at the point where organizations can have tools available to stop us from exfiltrating and creating that C2. Right? So, okay, we could work really hard to get around that. Or do we want to just make the same decision we did 10 years ago and be like, look, let's make the assumption someone's in. Let's make the assumption someone can create C2. And what can we gain access to internally and pivot? Because those are three different things, right?
Yeah.
And one of the pieces there is around the security maturity of the organization you're testing and their understanding of where they are realistically.
Yeah,
that's kind of the differentiator. We said this, all of us have said this on the show before, that the gap between good pen test companies and the pen test puppy mills is going to continue to widen, and this is a good demonstration of where it's widening. And having that initial access being something like, hey, we got to go demonstrate because the client doesn't understand or is not efficient or wants to test all the controls and evaluate real risk, then we have to go do good physical assessments in combination with some of this. Or they really do understand that physically, they probably will get something put on there, so you move more to an assumed breach or a white card or some level of purple team, and that's because their maturity warrants that. But as we start to look at this, we really have to make sure that these vendors are not getting complacent or lazy as well, and being able to evaluate at that TTP level where it's not just a signature or it's not just a particular thing that they're watching. They're able to do this at the layer 2 and COM level. They're looking for anomalies and heuristics, because I'll tell you right now, even though we haven't been able to use something like HTTPS or HTTP or TCP beacons, we are most certainly using things like Slack API or GitHub or uploading to Pastebin and having C2 channels through very creative and alternate comms, and attackers are doing the same. So you're going to have a very hard time seeing that C2 and detecting those particular C2 channels if you're not looking for heuristics, if you're not evaluating at the TTP level, because there's a million SaaS applications that I can abuse. So really understanding how to evaluate that anomaly and see spikes in traffic or things that are outside of your norm. That's where that we really have to push these EDR vendors and these security blinky light compliance things to move towards a really evaluating how how do we look at security and change what our mindset is in ways to protect that, and not just identify based on signatures?
Jeff,
yeah.
Hold on, wait, Jeff.
So much to say.
I love you, Jeff.
I love you too, guys. Before I start stepping on your toes, bless your hearts, all of you. I think you're all collectively expressing the fact that in this game that we call currently cybersecurity, but generations ago was expressed in different ways in terms of information security, data security, espionage, so on and so forth. In one sense, it's never ending, and it's always an evolutionary process where you have to up your game. What's, I think, unique and new, and in some ways, I think to me, it's sort of the 800-pound elephant in the room. Joff has done it a couple times, Larry and Tyler to a much lesser degree, but there's this implication that cybersecurity, and I use the term loosely in this context, sort of begins and ends with the experts, and the experts are pen testers, the experts are red teamers, hackers, and I don't believe that that's necessarily the case. Often true, but not necessarily always true. Certainly not the only people that have skin in the game. But the implication that pen testing is an industry that needs to sustain itself, I take issue with, because I feel like pen testing is an industry that should be putting itself out of business. And in a way, you guys are describing that you are, and you have to move on to the next thing. And maybe it's not called pen testing anymore.
Well, it's not putting ourselves out of business, Jeff. It is evolving. And I think the next step, the next step for a lot of pen testing right now is a flat pivot towards cloud resources and start to do significant evaluation of people's cloud deployments, because that's where people are making the mistakes.
Well, but Joff, hold on. Back that up a level. Take it to a higher level. Either we reach a point where we're relying on our defensive technologies to tell us whether or not we're hacked, and even if they progress to a very advanced point, we could be sitting there in an enterprise going, I've not been breached, because the attackers have progressed their game to bypass the techniques. They're not telling us how they did that, whereas the pen testers are telling us, hey, here's how I silently traversed your network and grabbed all of your intellectual property, and here's the recommendation on how to fix it. So, I think there's different states of being where people think they're secure. If we don't have pen testers to point out where they're able to bypass all of the defenses, we're in a losing game, because the attackers aren't going to tell us how they did it.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we don't have pen testers. Hold
on, Jeff. That was in response to Jeff's comment, so I want to give Jeff a chance to respond.
I agree and disagree, because and I'm quickly losing what you said already.
Pick one. You agree or you come on. Disagree.
Everything's gray. I'm trying to ease into it by saying I agree with you, but I really disagree. Again, pen testing, I think, serves a purpose, but I think largely in our industry, we have you guys are going to hate me for saying this. I think we have collectively an inflated view of the role that pen testing plays. And pragmatically, we think we're the only ones that know what's wrong, care, are saying anything, which I think is often the case, but not always the case. There's more and other people in the industry. You shouldn't, and I had the revelation and stopped pen testing 15, 16 years ago, and we've talked about that before, and much the same reasons and the same angst. But there ought to be a way for security professionals, information security professionals, and I know there's been debates online on Twitter and Facebook the last couple of days about what that means and what that is, but people that know this stuff, you shouldn't have to break in and pen test to convince people that they've got problems. There ought to be other ways to approach it that, in my mind, are more cost-effective, are more likely to be heard and received. And pen testing, I think, still has a place, but has a place for organizations that have more maturity. And more maturity doesn't mean that they've afforded to buy more technology and thrown more technology, or they've thrown it all to the cloud and they think they've absolved themselves of the issues. I think there's more to it than that. So I love pen testing and I love to talk about pen testing, but I think we overinflate it in some ways. I think we describe it and place expectations on it because from our perspective, very often we think it's the only game in town. But it's not, and neither do I think it's not. I think it shouldn't be. Yes, it's important. Yes, it has a role. And for the love of God, we probably don't even agree on the definition of what pen testing is at this point. And let's not even go down that rabbit hole. But do you get the idea of what I'm trying to say? Is that there's more to this, and keep stepping outside. Yes, it's an evolution, Joff, but the evolution also necessarily involves not just learning the new technology and the techniques, but perhaps expanding into, what else is there in terms of trying to teach and educate and get our customers or the organizations that we work for to actually make the changes and do the things that they need to do to get to somewhat mythical place of security.
But Jeff, to your point, I think it's a matter of timing, right? Like if we didn't do any pen testing, right? Let's enter a world where there's no pen testing, right? The most forward-thinking and mature enterprises in security, conceivably, without pen testing, in your view, and I agree with this view, right? We shouldn't need pen testing to tell us where deficiencies are, right? We should know what those are. And the most forward-thinking organizations would find those deficiencies, and then they would have to maybe tell the other organizations in the world that, hey, we observed these attackers, breaking in this way. And I think for the rest of the world, that would be too late. I think where pen testing has its value is it's a model for how you might be attacked to allow you to develop those defensive strategies before those real-world attacks actually happen.
So,
well, I'll say this, Paul, and then I'll shut up. And let others speak. This goes back to the roundtable discussion we had with SCOTUS a couple years ago, the holiday issue. If you look at the risk equation in its component parts, risk being a function of threats to your environment, your enterprise, vulnerabilities within your enterprise, and mitigations, what you do to that, I would simply suggest that maybe the evolution that needs to happen is pen testing, right or wrong, still to this day, and I contributed to this in my early days of pen testing, unfortunately, revolves around discovering vulnerabilities. And while it is a way to discover vulnerabilities, I think part of the evolution that needs to happen is that it needs to do more of what you were just describing, and I'll just say it differently, threat emulation. There's many other ways to discover vulnerabilities in your environment, and they're necessarily not just technical vulnerabilities, they're not just bugs, they're not just misconfigurations, they're much more importantly, there's process failures that are vulnerabilities. And guess what? If you look at most of the breaches that we've talked about over the last umpty-ump years, they can be traced back to process failure, even though specifically it might have been a missing patch or a misconfiguration, but it's process failure. So the threats are what they are. And again, threats in my classic DoD training are the bad guys. They're the who. They're not the what. The whats are the attacks. It's just my nomenclature. Vulnerabilities are something that we can tackle. They don't go away completely, but we hopefully get our arms around them many different ways. Pen testing may be the evolution that we're really talking about that needs to happen necessarily, and it's for the mature organization, is threat emulation. How well pen testing, in my mind, is supposed to be a test of how well your defenses are, how well your security program has been set up, how well does it work. Hire the pen testers to come in and put you through your paces. I mean, it's the essence going all the way back to the movie Sneakers. That's what they were in theory trying to do. In effect, though, penetration testing has become, because people don't do all the other things, it becomes a listing of vulnerabilities and exposures, and we have become deceived, I think, within the community of thinking that pen testing is the primary method of finding vulnerabilities, discovering vulnerabilities for organizations, institutions, because effectively it is, and we see that, but it shouldn't be, and I don't think it not that it doesn't need to be, it shouldn't be in the sense that there's another way to approach this. I'll shut up now.
But I think pen testing or threat emulation will exist from a third party so long as it's way too difficult to envision and map those threats in your own environment, right? And put context behind them. And I think, especially today, and I think for the foreseeable future, it's far too difficult to be able to model and think about those threats within your own environment without someone actually doing it to be effective, right? And I hope we get to the day where we can build and evolve and secure networks on an ongoing basis where we don't need a person to be able to point out those attack paths and do that threat emulation. But I'm kind of in the camp of, I think we're always going to need that. I think our systems are going to be increasingly complex over the years. I don't think AI is going to progress to the point where we don't need a human being or a team of human beings to be able to realize and put all those threats together. And that's how complex that it is. I do agree with you to a certain extent, Jeff, that I think we can get farther than we are today in many organizations without pen tests and doing that threat emulation, right? I agree. I think many organizations be like, look, I don't need a team to go and come in and emulate the threats,
but
right?
you're misunderstanding what I was saying then, Paul. I'm not saying that companies should substitute threat emulation and not have a pen test. I'm saying that they should do all the other things to discover vulnerabilities and problems and holes and build a solid security program, and then bring in the third party to do an actual threat emulation pen test, which is what I think.
That I agree with. Yeah, you should do as much as you're capable of and be creative as you can be to think about those threats and then defend your architecture and infrastructure accordingly. And then, like you said, bring in people to test that, right? That should be a continual process. But I mean, that's getting harder and harder as time goes on.
To weigh in?
So
do we have other stories? I mean, we got to really.
I'd like to see if Mick had one that popped out to him.
Yeah, so here's my take on it, right? You guys are both agreeing with one another, and really what pen testing is, and don't get me wrong, I find it fun. I like doing pen tests, but I don't want that to be the primary thing that my company does, because I view pen testing really as audit with like extra pizzazz. Pen testing, when done right, is QA with really good marketing. Because what you're doing is finding those vulnerabilities, finding those exposures. You're not popping domain admin. You're finding all the ways that an attacker could get domain admin and then what they can do with it.
Yeah, I agree, Mig. It's about identifying attack paths, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, we got way off on a tangent. And that was a fun tangent. That was a fun tangent. And Jeff, we don't hate you. Healthy debates are part of what makes the show fun.
I sometimes hate you, but not all the time.
I do want to talk about, speaking of espionage and advanced attacks, I want to get the group's take on Naikon APT hid 5-year espionage attack under the radar. They said that, and this is a Chinese APT espionage attack. They said their primary method of attack was to infiltrate a government body, use that body's contacts, documents, and data to launch attacks on others, exploiting the trust in diplomatic relations between departments and governments to increase the chances of success. Lee, I know you had this story, and I want to get others' take on China largely not taking front and center stage in the air quotes APT game and cyber espionage game lately, right? We've largely left that to Russia disrupting elections and other groups doing hacking, right? The PLA largely has been silent for a number of years, but now this story comes out that kind of front and center that this is happening.
I'd like to hear what else other people say. My first reaction was that I think that the timeline is probably a lot longer than they think. 5 years is pretty short for China.
China plays the long game. I think it's one thing we've established on this show is China plays the long game, right? They're in it for the long haul.
But regardless of the time frame, I mean, they're gonna sit there, they're gonna work their way in, they're gonna exfil data, they're gonna influence people. It's just, I'm arguing that it was probably at least double the 5 years listed, but the effect's the same.
I think this is
Tyler's kind of.
largely...
I saw Tyler squirming in the seat there, like, what can I say? What can I can't say? I'm a double agent, maybe for multiple countries, and
this is a prime example of why you don't see a ton of hype or a ton of publicity or even data breach stuff around like APT groups, right? The game is intelligence still. It's an intelligence gathering mechanism. It's a body of a government or an intelligence agency that's doing work in order to gain intelligence. That usually means you don't have to be super noisy. You don't have to grab a whole bunch of data. You don't have to exfil a ton of data. You're really sitting there trying to figure out what is happening, understand and have an inside hand or game, have a ear to the ground in very strategic locations, and then learn about new strategic locations that you need to be getting into. When you think about stuff like state and local government, where does all your voting happen? What kind of data sharing and network connections end up happening between state and local government? You end up with law enforcement. You end up with NCIC databases being shared between federal government and local government. You end up with elected officials changing hands and AKA vendors changing hands. So all of these particular strategic advantages, if you see like a proposal for the next person that's running for election and communications to a new technology company, I would venture to say you'd probably want to be in that technology company prior to that election so that you can then make that pivot to the next, seat or the next, have your stuff set up for the next regime. And so these are the pieces that people really don't think about when you're thinking about APT. APT is not loud. They're not noisy. They're not dumping huge data breaches. They're not pulling, all the experience stuff and putting them on a pay spin. They're in it for the long game. They need to be able to listen. They need to have actionable reports to send up the chain to their hires so that they can, continue doing the intelligence game. That's the whole point.
Yeah, and I think one of the things in my recent research that I've realized is that we know today a lot about what's happened in the past, 50 years, and so do other nation states, right? And I'm really curious as to what the methods are today and in the future to conduct this type of nation-state attacks and espionage that, maybe 10 plus years from now we'll learn about and go, wow, I never really considered that, right? So the kind of supply chain is somewhat what you're alluding to, Tyler, right? And what I've learned recently, and it's interesting how they've gone into this in the book about Stuxnet, is that the precedent for some of these more modern attacks goes back all the way to like the Cold War, right? Like we were feeding the Soviet Union bogus plans for building critical infrastructure, for building nuclear energy and refining nuclear energy way before we were doing that for Iran, or maybe around the same time. And then, as Stuxnet came about, we were doing that in a very different way. But the precedent for these attacks has been set. Like this goes back to the 70s and 80s, right? And when I read all of this, I'm like, so what does that mean today? And I'm somewhat concerned that we're not covering that in the press today. Like there hasn't been this big explosion of, this is a little bit of inkling of how it's been done with this Naikon APT attack, right? But I think a lot of, to your point, Tyler, things are flying more under the radar because it's very dispersed and very much playing the long game. And those facts aren't going to come out for a very long time because they're spending so much time hiding. It's taking so much longer for us to figure out exactly what's going on. Many of the methods aren't really new. Like I said, Russia had incidents where pipelines exploded and other such things, and it was only 20 years later when someone came out and really corroborated the story to say that, yeah, likely that was part of a espionage campaign.
Think about chipsets, or think about think about firmware and base code sets that live in critical infrastructure, live in design, microprocessors that, well, the microprocessors change. A lot of the code base does not. And if it does, it is just being updated and not totally rewritten. So if you think about the long game and what we're going to see probably 10 years from now is a lot of the hardware chips and supply chain, right, is going to be huge. We're going to come to the realization that there may be long-term code bases that we just didn't understand. There's really, really difficult to analyze even a single hardware device or platform at the level in which, an APT would hide. Larry can attest to some of the hardware we've done, and really that becomes very difficult. And you think about that over a long period of time and how many devices, even our HDMI cables at this point could be compromised, and we wouldn't know it right now because we're not doing analysis on them.
Yeah, my
all
story,
of these chipsets and stuff.
My story number 4 kind of hints to that. And when I saw the title, "Designing Firmware Resiliency for the Top 3 Attack Vectors," I was like, oh, like here we go, another story about IoT and firmware resiliency and blah blah blah. And then I read it, I was like, wow, that person really knew their stuff. Like, this is not your average everyday article about being resilient in firmware. This person's talking about largely, and I believe the author works for Intel, is what I garnered from the article, and was very succinctly talking about these style attacks and how your firmware has to be very resilient to prevent these backdoors and other abuses being in them, and firmware not being the IP camera that is just so vulnerable. It's got a default password and it's got a vulnerable web application and things like that. That's really like the low-hanging fruit that we talk about in SSH brute force passwords, right, Lee, that we a mutual article that we shared, right? This article is talking about making sure your firmware is truly resilient as a subcomponent of a system, right? As Tyler pointed out, the HDMI subsystem inside the cable, the UEFI.
Think about your baseband within your phone that your cellular provider automatically updates over and off the band network patch.
I got to interrupt you guys. Doesn't it go lower than that? I mean, we know, I know, I don't know how much you guys know, I'm sure you do. Go below firmware. There's microcode in central processing units.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Who's developing the microcode for these various things?
China.
And not always China, but sometimes China. And
Taiwan.
Are there completely hidden instruction sets at the microcode level that can be activated in the future?
Yes, and these aren't like, oh, it's a default password and it's wormable, right? These are, at some juncture, something triggers to cause failures that are difficult to trace back to microcode that's been written maybe 5 years ago that just now activates,
and you're not
right?
you're not going to find any evidence of that in firmware because the firmware is the assembly code level. Microcode is the level below that. So.
But that's what we, and I say we as the U.S. in Stuxnet, right? But that was a tactic that, let's just say it was the U.S. And I know the U.S. will deny it, and I totally get it. And I understand now the political climate that went behind it, and I understand the motivations. But let's just say that you want to be able to cause failures or some condition that right away doesn't attribute to malicious behavior, but just attributes to failure. Right, there are centrifuges that are, exploding and falling over. Well, is that hardware failure? Is that software? All of us have been involved in troubleshooting of a similar nature of hardware and software. Going, what's causing the failure? You may never really truly have definitive evidence to say what caused that failure. But if someone deliberately put something in that microcode, to your point, Joff, right, that could cause those failures in a very subtle manner. That's the type of espionage that we're talking about today, which is very scary to me.
Yep. And Joff, I want to say we've even seen something like this. You tickled something in the back of my brain that was about the microcode, and I want to say there was some issues with Intel microcode within the last, I want to say year, but knowing my luck, it was within the last 3 years that we talked about on the show.
Yep.
something with the microcode on the Intel processors that was like a huge
Spectre
freaking
meltdown,
deal.
right?
And to Mick's point earlier, I think the vulnerability had a logo and a theme song and all this stuff to go along.
Yeah, Spectre and meltdown were certainly microcode ish vulnerabilities, if not straight microcode on the processor that was a vulnerability, but that was very visible. I think what Java you're referring to is the kind of the subtle things that can be built into this.
And the part that bothers me the most, to be honest, and I know some people directly that are involved in chip manufacturing in my area, and the part that bothers me the most is that the production pipeline for some of the ASIC level stuff. And I have to assume this also maps over to processor development. It is 5 to 10 years long. So before that thing even hits the marketplace, it is baked in, like way before.
And when you talk ASICs and FPGAs, like that stuff is that complicated that the development time is that long.
Yeah. And so, you're sitting on a situation like, I had a friend of mine, and I won't mention him by name, but I was working with him, actually inadvertently through my kids' robotics club at the time. And he was telling me, he goes, look, we have wire speed. We were having a discussion about intrusion detection, intrusion prevention at the time. And this was like 8 years ago. He was telling me, he's like, look, we've got wire speed IDS capability now for like 10 to 40 gigabit. I'm like, you're kidding me. You cast yourselves back, right? We're talking 8-10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And he goes, no, we have it. It's just going to take near a decade to surface on the market.
Wow. You think about our debugging life cycles for our own software, right? It could be hours, maybe a day, right? Now to talk about 10 years to perfect a technology like that.
Yeah.
That's
and
crazy.
So when you look at chip level stuff and you look at microcode and the testing and all the intricacies involved, if you don't have ultimate trust in that that level of it, that's it. I mean beyond that, it's pure gate design at the chip level. But physical stuff you can examine. Microcode, a little bit more of a challenge. Right.
Along those lines, the hardware and such, hacker buys old Tesla parts on eBay and finds all this data. I was amazed at the I forget what the part was that they bought off of the MCU.
The MCU for the mobile entertainment unit.
Yeah. So examples included phone books from connected cell phones, which largely you can get from any of the devices in cars, call logs, recent calendar entries, Spotify, and Wi-Fi passwords stored in plain text, which was interesting to me. Locations for home and work, which my cars actually do today, which are not Teslas, right? In all places navigated to, all session cookies that allowed access to Netflix and YouTube, and attached Gmail accounts. The stored in plain text is really really concerning to me. Like remote access into these devices means, those are just stored in plain text.
And Paul, also on these, they were also found on devices that were allegedly factory reset.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So the immediate question that comes to mind is, hey Elon, if I could call him Elon, hey mate, Elon, can you please define for me what factory reset means?
Yeah, it means the .config directory is wiped out, but the .cache directory that stores your credentials is not wiped out. Is what all that means, right?
Yeah.
And for these devices, the process for some of the repair shops and all that type of stuff is to actually take these devices, and they have to be returned, or they have to provide certificate of destruction. And the certificate of destruction is basically taking the connector and smashing the shit out of it.
Yeah,
to me, that's not a barrier.
But it begs
I'll
the
take
question.
that thing apart and I'll put a new connector on it,
right?
Soldered connector, and
but
I'll
it
still
begs
get
the
access to
question:
the same stuff.
if I bring my Tesla in for service and I need a new MCU, it's outside of my hands. What happens to my old MCU?
Yeah,
my car?
It's also apparently outside of Tesla's hands, because this stuff is not supposed to be showing up on the used market, and is.
Right.
Well, there's another factor too, and that is that when you get to a certain level of car and you work on it, there's a mantra: don't impact the owner. It's got to be just like they left it. You replace the MCU, all their shit's got to be there.
I want that
programming settings.
Like at what point I paid for the car that had the original MCU, and now I paid for the new MCU. Shouldn't I, as the owner, be given back that old MCU with my data on it? Like we talk about GDR and privacy rights, and these are questions that probably people outside of our field wouldn't necessarily think to ask. But like now looking at the situation, like no, I want my old MCU. Like that's mine. Why is it yours if you replaced it?
Yeah, but then we're going to charge you the
very much going into the repair shop, and they say, oh well, we need to do like $3,000 worth of work to your car. We got to replace the tie rod ends. We need to replace the brake pads. When something like that happens to me, I go in and say, yeah, great, go ahead and fix those. But you give me the tie rod ends, and I want to see how badly they're worn after you replace them, and put them in a rag in the trunk. Because
But with data privacy, though, if it's a mechanical part that doesn't store any of my personal data, whatever. Right, but if it's a part inside of a vehicle that now has my data on it, that is some type of electronic piece, I think there should be legislation that says I get that back, or I have the option to get that back myself, to be able to control my data, to be able to do what I want with that, to be able to wipe it myself, destroy it myself, so that my data isn't going out to someone else. Because if I don't know what's wrong with the car necessarily. Like I wouldn't maybe wipe the MCU before I brought it into service, but if I don't know that that's going to be replaced, why would I do that, right?
Right, and back to that same sort of thing, the tie rod ends, the mechanical parts, like same thing. Prove it to me that you replaced the part that you say you did by giving me the junk part.
Right.
What if all this really doesn't matter, because the way in which these companies make their money is off of the telemetry? How many cameras are on a Tesla? How much telemetry data are these particular cameras gathering? Like
a lot.
How fast is the weather? What happened during this particular time? What is the road condition? What is the elevation change? What is the base map that's being now pulled in via telemetry data via all of these vehicles? And every time you dock your power, that data is then being uploaded via a mechanism.
Oh, you mean like, hey, you got into an accident and it was raining out and your wipers weren't on. Because the auto sensor that turned on the wipers was malfunctioning and you didn't have your wipers on, therefore it's your fault for getting in the accident.
No accident needed. No, you went to the grocery store and it was raining and you had to change an elevation and you parked in this parking spot, and we can see copies of the pictures.
And you didn't have your mask on when you went into the store, and therefore
the road condition and elevation change and pressure within inside of the air and amount of precipitation given this particular day and time and place, that data is all being gathered, and so the MCU with the Wi-Fi password seems very, very kind of minimal, and I think that's why they really don't care so much.
This is like a sci-fi movie where like the underground movement is all riding bicycles that don't have electronics in them because the surveillance state is monitoring everyone else's vehicle.
When there's surveillance, you got to think about that telemetry data and the value of what that telemetry data they could be using that for, like building maps, building weather graphs. There's a million uses of all of these particular data points. Are they picking up IMEI base stations? Are they grabbing all the SSIDs as they're driving? Like, this telemetry is already built into the car. The computer's already collecting a lot of this telemetry, and this is not like out there. This is known. Where is that data going, and who's monitoring and commoditizing that, and what is that data actually being paid for and purchased for? The car that's not really their market at the end of the day. And you start to think about that, then you realize why that MCU is, and the data destruction process or whatever's happening
doesn't matter. They already have the data on your MCU.
And to think about it, to raise a point about this particular one, it would be very simple for Tesla to push down an OTA firmware, an over-the-air firmware update, to encrypt those data, particularly provide a protection mechanism that would be super simple for them to do, because they're updating these cars all the goddamn time.
Yep. Yeah, that is true. By the way, if you've gone out and eBay searched for a Tesla MCU, there are a ton of matches. So you too can play in this world.
Interesting. I want to talk about
Paul, if you don't mind, I want to hit one that's on a similar vein.
Please do.
I saw one that was a story about an 8-year-old botnet on IoT that finally came to light, and it targeted some very specific type of network attack storage devices. And the only reason why this botnet existed for 8 years was so that it could harvest anime that people were putting on their NAS.
Wow.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
That's a really specific botnet.
Yeah, there were quite a few devices that were found to be affected. They were the D-Link NVRs.
What kind of anime are we talking about, Larry? Are we talking about like adult anime? Are we talking about anime movies?
The fact that they had a botnet and that's what they chose to do with it, that's where I'm stuck.
I mean, that's dedication.
That's where I'm stuck. Yeah, that's awesome, man, Tyler.
Yep. It reached its
So
peak
true.
in 2015 when it amassed more than 10,000 devices exploited.
I like in the story that they characterize it as a hobby project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Look, I'll be honest. I'm not a huge fan of the adult, like sexual in nature anime.
It's
throwing
weird.
that out there. I do like Ghost in the Shell, Ninja Scroll. Those kind of anime is cool, but like to create a whole botnet to go harvest that, that's just kind of interesting.
That's like next level shit right there.
I would venture to guess it was probably of the adult pornographic nature anime that they were trying to harvest from.
Probably, but still a very specific type of botnet.
I think kind of next level freaky is what I'm thinking right now.
Yeah,
just like your background, Joff.
Hey, nice, huh?
Well, I mean, because if you want to go watch the anime movies, like I mentioned, and TV shows, those are probably readily available. If you have a fetish in the other areas, you're going to go to great lengths maybe to explore that fetish and maybe perhaps go create a botnet for that. Very interesting.
I've seen enough tentacle porn to know where this is going.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. Speaking of, hold on. We had another porn story. We have to talk about this one. This was Cam 4 had a data breach.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of good information in that.
Tyler, yes.
Data breach,
Tyler, tell us.
I imagine at some point.
Well, hold on, Tyler.
Wait.
Tyler, tell us about Cam 4. We need to set the context here. And you are apparently our expert in this area.
I mean, apparently this is like some kind of a porn site of some kind that has cams attached to it. That's all I know about that.
That I've never visited or harvested any of the streams. Yeah.
Overhead cams?
Okay.
Moving
on.
Honestly, like the Wikipedia article was not very informative either.
They're darn wikis. I thought they were informative.
I thought they were gospel.
Wait, no. So hold on. I thought Cam 4 was like that's like the random like cam sites where the people go on all the random cams and stuff. Larry, what were those ones? The
chat roulette.
Chat roulette. I thought it was kind of similar to that.
Oh.
I would put it in that category.
That would make sense, I guess.
In any case,
just sort of anecdotally, right?
What's killing me on this is
that
the
would make a
volume.
lot of sense.
But people have registered for this cam site.
Yeah, this is a paid
But now,
service.
Tyler, what you were telling us is like with like an exuberant amount of data about them.
Yeah, there's a substantial amount of data supposedly in this breach, and again, I've yet to see the actual raw data yet. But you're talking name, email address, some billing. There's some device ID information around from like mobile app information. There's sexual preference, gender, all kinds of PII that,
along
if
with
obtained,
like
when obtained,
video streams of these people, probably not with clothes on, is kind of what it sounds
I would
like.
assume so, because supposedly this is like a 7 terabyte dump. So, thinking about it and looking through the records and what we've got for dumps, the numbers didn't add up from just a pure record standpoint. Whether it was like all the PII they said and all the records, and even if we doubled the number, that wasn't even close to that amount. So we're thinking a file kind of a file level dump of one of the file servers that had a lot of this information. So you got database, you end up with recorded video, maybe potential chats, chat logs, billing information. So we're assuming that there's a substantial amount of like just raw dump, not just database dump or credential dump, but an actual raw dump of someone's kind of either NAS or network.
Let's just hope not like
core dump, fecal dump.
Yeah, let's just not hope like actual dumps as Jeff is alluding to. Like, please.
Well, I mean,
with 7 terabytes, probably, but oh god, it's just
a lot of data.
But it goes back to what I'm sure all of you also kind of coach your family and friends on. Regardless of the situation, whatever you put online is public. And it's not ephemeral. Like, whatever you put online is probably stored somewhere and could be brought up at any given time. And that doesn't mean you have to run for political office, right? Like, whatever you put online is public.
Yeah, it's not like Vegas. It's not like Vegas.
Yeah. So you can leave it in Vegas. Once it's online, you really do leave it online forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I foresee in a substantial amount of time that this data, once sold off and kind of disseminated through the dark channels, another kind of Ashley Madison realization and extortion campaign, and maybe even phishing around that. But I see a lot of extortion around some of this stuff, as it may end up being more potentially damaging. Maybe your sexual preference was something that is otherwise not public, and so you're going to try to hide that. So I believe there's going to be some issues there.
But how much extortion did we really see? And we probably didn't see any of it because it was all swept under the rug. How much extortion did we see out of the Ashley Madison breach?
I've heard that there was a pretty substantial push for some of that, but again,
I would
when
agree
it's
with
extortion,
Tyler.
You usually don't hear about it because it gets paid.
It gets I would agree with Tyler. I think the kind of rumblings were there was definitely some extortion that was going on with that breach, Larry.
My recollection with Ashley Madison is it sat for a couple years, and then suddenly the extortion started a few years later. Not
someone got the brilliant idea, like, hey, we got this amazing data here, and it is being underutilized, aka this last botnet we talked about. Maybe we should do something more interesting with it.
But this comes back to an Elasticsearch database that wasn't secured. I mean, I keep shaking my head. Why is that so hard? But I guess cloud is really complicated, and I keep underestimating people's ability to secure it.
Well, yeah, and we talked about this. We talked about that this weekly, and we're going to talk about it next week on this show. That the cloud technologies, not necessarily SaaS, right? But in a different context, like what you're deploying new infrastructure to the cloud, it's so hard to secure today. It really is. It's very complicated, and it comes down to
it's not complicated. It's syntax. Damn it.
It's true, Jeff. I mean, it's actually a pretty valid point. And it comes down to, you got to put your faith into protecting your data, right? In some context, right? Protecting your database and making sure it's not exposed. You got to know you
still need to do it, and you're not flipping responsibility over to a third party.
Correct.
And
the way they advertise.
You still need the pen testing industry, Jeff, man.
Because there's nobody else in the world that can tell you that the cloud is insecure.
I mean, it's good to have the check and balance, right?
To put it in that context, though, is I think where the pen testing services really shine, right?
Well, that attacker's mindset is really hard for most people to either have or do. If you're in the blue with, if you're a defender, I've been a defender I was there 15 years. I knew some of the attacks, and I knew kind of, where to look and how to secure it, and I followed the best practices and the frameworks. But at the end of the day, I didn't have that attacker's mindset. I didn't realize the chain of events that could chain something so simple together and how to put those priorities.
And here's a great or really bad example of that, right? My story number 10. This company, the Toll Group, I believe they're in Australia, Joff. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they were ransomware not once but twice. What they say is it's two completely independent incidents, an unrelated ransomware incidents that was different from an earlier one they had. They claim they have no intention in either incident to engage with ransomware demands. There's no evidence that at this stage suggests that any data has been extracted from our network, which I find hard to believe if you're the victim of ransomware twice and claiming that in both cases you have no evidence of data being exfiltrated. The trend that I'm seeing is that attackers will download the plain text data, right, encrypt it, and then put it back. Is one kind of aspect of ransomware. Any film, Nifilm, was the ransomware that they used. It was spread through likely. Now, they don't claim any hard evidence against this, but it was spread through remote desktop or RDP protocol, similar to other ransomware families, Natimity, Crisis, and SamSam. They said in those cases they gained access through vulnerable RDP servers. It's a pretty common development path for new ransomware actors. They start with open or vulnerable RDP servers and expand their attacks from there. Although they didn't say that both ransomware incidents were a result of vulnerable RDP servers, but these strains of malware tend to favor that exploitation technique, but newer versions have used other forms of that attack.
So
not once, but twice.
What I find interesting about this is it is a replay on something that we're seeing as a trend, worldwide, and that is, and like any criminal attack, let's go after the weak link, and the weak link is usually, unfortunately, infrastructure entities in the world that have, that have traditionally come from non-IT based systems, or very, industrially based systems, moved into the IT world and just don't know what they've done, and ended up in a world that they have, they frankly don't know what they're doing in that world, right?
Right. I need remote access, so therefore 3389 from the internet, it's all good, right?
Right. And we've seen this play out over and over, whether it's water companies, whether it's electric companies, whether it's trucking companies, whether it's, and I almost blame us. We need to take a lead role here and engage these people. Like, if you are actually going to get on the internet here and move into the modern world and get some systems out there, they need some significant guidance. I mean, this is not a joke. This is not.
Yeah, it's interesting, Josh, to that point. We were talking about RDP, in fact, today, right, as a potential solution for some things here in production. And I was explaining to Johnny, I'm like, this is a tried and true protocol. He's like, how reliable is it? I'm like, hold on, let me think back. Like, I was playing with RDP in early 2000s. I'm like, this is a truly reliable protocol.
Totally.
And one that we, to Job's point, we've really done our best to try and educate people. This is not something you expose to the internet. This is not something that has really touted true security as its like defining property, right? I think reliability and speed and all those things are certainly an attribute of it, but certainly not the security aspect of it. And so there's
tried and true is not the equivalent of secure, is what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah. The protocol functions very, very well in terms of providing a remote desktop session, right? But if you look at its history and security, it's very, very weak. And Microsoft, to its credit, has made improvements, right? But there's bugs in it, as is evidenced by Bluekeep, I believe, is the RDP vulnerability, right? And so, I mean, we're using it internally. What's interesting is I played around with Guacamole for the first time. Holy crap, is that awesome? Like, that is such a cool...
Delicious, too.
Delicious. Yeah. Guacamole is delicious, and it was Cinco de Mayo this week, which is kind of ironic, right? But Guacamole is an Apache project that gives you kind of a client-server environment for RDP. I played around with it today, and I tell you what, in a very short amount of time, I was able to stand it up and have RDP sessions. I'm like, this is awesome. And so I can see that translating to, we should open that to the internet because it works phenomenally well. What I think is missing is a lot of those security controls, in those connections and in that protocol that have persisted over time.
Well, so it's not so much about the protocol as it is about the controls. And my advice, consulting advice to most of my clients today is, if you are going to expose a service to the internet that is an authenticated service and you do not have a second factor of authentication, you are asking for trouble.
Yeah, and Jeff, yes. I had a great tutorial, and I wish I had the link. I have the link saved somewhere, but they walk through like how to set it up. And then they walk through how to set up second factor if you're going to expose it to the internet. The article did a fantastic job. Right now, I wasn't exposing it to the internet. This was for internal systems only. But I thought the article, I gave it props because it said, look, you're going to expose it to the internet. You're going to want this second factor. And it showed you how to set up Duo to authenticate.
But isn't the proper way to demonstrate it to hire a firm to do a pen test to show how exploitable it is?
Well, Jeff, I've actually done that in the past, even internally. To the credit, I think, of pen testing and protocols like RDP, it's actually my poster child for Windows administrators that are like, Microsoft says this is the way we should have remote access set up for our systems. Therefore, it must be secure. And very early on in my career, I did a demonstration where I'm like, so this is your username and password for domain admin, right? And they were like, holy crap. And they actually set forth a project to secure that because I pointed out the security shortcomings of that particular protocol. In RDP, it also, to kind of caveat that story, is a very unique situation.
Not to digress, but did you also tell them that they shouldn't be using the domain admin account at all?
That was part of the conversation, Jeff. Absolutely. Okay. Early on, that was harder. I think there's better methods today to controlling domain admin access. But yeah, that was certainly. Yeah,
I mean, there is a time and place for sticking the dog's nose in the dog shit, I guess. But I think there's more benign, there ought to be a way to sit down and just say, hey, this is bad. You should do this, without having to.
You're right. There's multiple.
Do all the fun stuff.
There's bad. You shouldn't do this, and then there's also kind of the higher level of not only shouldn't you not do that, you should also separate your everyday user account from your domain admin user account, right? So there are multiple levels to that.
Oh, now that's crazy talk.
Yeah, right. And I mean that's not an easy thing to do. Certainly, I
had a question for the pen testers in our group. I'm wondering, how are you still seeing insecure RDP, or is that becoming less prevalent? Mick, Tyler, Joff.
Insecure RDP is less prevalent.
Not secured.
Yeah, it's usually secured. It's usually a means to do password spraying, look for password reuse out of dump files. Build password lists.
Yeah, I think with RDP, we could do a whole segment on it, right? Because there's different encryption levels independent of different levels of authentication that also incorporate two-factor, right? There's a lot of different.
And Microsoft recommends, not even just doing raw RDP. Like there's the terminal server gateway or remote desktop gateways that have been available with, network level authentication that has two-factor that's from a specific IP that comes from a specific host that's part of a domain that has a user account.
We could do a whole segment on that. Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
But I will tell you that I have encountered, and I literally wrote about it this week without mentioning anybody in particular, an RDP session that could be negotiated with RC4 cipher 128-bit.
And that's the old encryption method, correct?
Deprecated encryption.
Yep.
Very old. Of course, there's no certificate pinning or anything like that, so it's very easy to intercept. So There's stuff out there that's ugly still, and again, I go back to my consulting. Even if you had weak encryption, if you're deploying something directly facing the internet that allows authentication, get a second factor in there.
Yeah.
You're going to do a whole lot better. Man in the middle is a tough issue, right? Yeah, it's a pain in the ass. You can man in the middle, and you can intercept stuff, but the opportunity for man in the middle is usually like public cafe wireless kind of stuff, right? And not that that's not doable. It is absolutely doable, but without the second factor, I can play password guessing games. And password guessing games means I'm going to get access to your organization eventually.
Right.
Yep. Mick,
Right.
we get Mick to weigh in here if he's still awake over there.
So I still see bad RDP all the time, but fortunately, it's starting to be enclaved out. Like, I think that the message is getting out, and that we're seeing more and more legacy networks being set up. So there's still plenty of opportunity, and these sorts of bits of job security, as I jokingly call them, aren't going away anytime soon.
Yeah,
Mick, a real quick question for you. Is that a casting couch behind you by any chance? Because it's a black leather sofa.
And more to the point, where are the babes?
So I want to close out the question on RDP. Is okay. You've run into inappropriately secured RDP. You bring it to your customer. Are they receptive to changing it, or are they like, well, it's okay because of reason 72, go away?
That varies.
Or
my experience
fill in the
is,
blank excuse.
Yeah, my experience is probably 15 plus years ago, right? And it's interesting we're still having that conversation because there are so many different ways to deploy it, depending on your OS level and other such factors, in my opinion.
Okay.
So
mine comes down to sometimes it depends on the situation, but in some situations it's a third-party vendor. I don't know what to do with it, and so my response to them is, why are you doing business with that third-party vendor?
Yeah. Yeah, there are better ways, independent of RDP, to gain remote access in a much more secure manner that create ephemeral authentication to gain remote desktop access.
That's your word of the day. You've said that like 3 times tonight already.
But yeah, like in the case of remote,
I'm out of wine.
I think they call themselves Beyond Trust now, right? But that's like the culmination of BombGuard and all those other companies, right? And there are a few companies out there that do it, right? That do that ephemeral, like I need admin access and I'm granted that for a certain amount of time, and it's very much more tightly controlled than what's offered natively. I did want to talk about 2 other stories before we close out. WordPress sites are being attacked, very specifically. WordFence.
Again?
If you want to read the details, the WordFence blog post goes into great detail. And I had to dig a little to find this. They are very much embedded inside of plugins. But there are cross-site scripting vulnerabilities inside of WordPress plugins. But the other kind of the other story, because I noticed it too, I was like, it seems like we're talking more about WordPress vulnerabilities lately. And there was another article, I think, from Dark Reading, my story number 12, that attacks on WordPress sites are on a surge. And I don't think that's necessarily pinned to any particular vulnerability. It just seems to be on the uptick. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm seeing a lot more buzz about attacking WordPress sites for whatever reason. It could be because of the COVID-19. What's that?
Said people are stuck at home and bored and think they want to start blogging.
And they want to spin up new blogging sites. Yeah, it's just something I can't put my finger on it. We talked about Keybase, I believe, last week. Established that as a very, very good encryption platform. Zoom has acquired Keybase, which I think is
apparently pushed Zoom over the top. They were listening to.
They listened to the show, and they were in negotiations already, right? And they pushed it over and said, "Well, the Security Weekly, people said Keybase was
in the
awesome,
mail.
right? And, yeah, we want our cut of that, right?
I did not know that. That's really great.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Well, it's interesting. Last week, Jeff, I posed the question to the other hosts. I'm like, Keybase. I'm like, it solid, right? Because what I read about Keybase was they were very much paying attention to security, very responsive, and built a great platform. And I really give props to Zoom for a lot of reasons.
I was going to say, so is Zoom, for the record. They really are paying attention.
Right? And because, if you're in Zoom's position, regardless of where you're in the organization, you're like, we really need to increase our security. We could go, maybe build some encryption to do end-to-end encryption for video and chat, or we could go buy someone. And who they chose to buy was a very smart choice. And Zoom this is their first acquisition, from what I've read. And I thought a very good one, and I thought very timely and very smart on the Zoom front. Zoom, they just got a bad rap. We did a segment, of course, weeks ago, and this is just evidence of, and I don't want to give us to, toot our own horn, right? But we identified a really great project that was doing a really good job with encryption, and Zoom's like, you're already in negotiations to buy them. I think is really cool and really good.
Yeah.
So I know we're probably almost all using Keybase in some form or another. Anybody thinking they'll change because of the acquisition?
No, I think Zoom's commitment to security, despite popular belief, has always been very strong, and I think they will absolutely uphold, in this acquisition, their commitment to security.
I'm the same way. I'm not faulting Zoom. I'm with Dave Kennedy on this. Dave Kennedy had a number of articles. One major article out. That was pretty good, pretty straight up. I again, without revealing any details, have done significant work in the area of Zoom integration with other apps, and I'm not dissatisfied. So, in a word, I think Zoom is doing the right things, and I'm pleased. We have to give them the props. I think they're doing the right things. Usability, how many companies? I mean, you just face it right now. How many companies out there can outright say our platform is super easy to use
and secure
at the same time? And Zoom is trying to strike that balance, and they are actually achieving that. Now, you're going to get some user error associated with that, and that's what we've seen. But I think that's collateral damage. I think props to them for doing the right things.
What's interesting is I referenced Z-Phone from Phil Zimmerman last week or the week earlier. That's for SIP-based communications, right? Mm-hmm. To my knowledge, Zoom does not use SIP-based communications. There is an open source project called Jitsi, very much an alternative to Zoom, but also supports SIP-based communications as an option, which I would assume maybe with some work and integration, you could integrate Z-Phone with as kind of a reference to a public key cryptography-based system for doing encrypted communications via voice, also via chat, right? Has those applications. And, now to kind of fast forward to this week to Zoom acquiring Keybase, they've essentially kind of brought that into the similar technology into the fold, which is just the right call, in my opinion.
Well, so the question really becomes, just backing out for a minute, providing encryption for voice and video conferencing technologies, that stuff's really difficult.
It is.
Because you have operational latency concerns, right?
But also key exchange as well, right? Like we've seen similar technologies where if you really want that end-to-end encryption, the two or more parties in this case, right? In the case of a group chat, right, have to all exchange keys. And that's also part of the equation that makes it difficult.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue separates itself into two areas, though. That there is the control plane and the data plane, and I spent a lot of time recently focusing on the control plane, which is the signaling, and you were mentioning SIP, which is another signaling protocol, and the control plane is equally important, if not more important, because the control plane is where the sensitive data is upon meeting initiation.
Is that because the control plane controls the routing, Joff?
No, it's because the control plane controls the exchange of the sensitive information surrounding the meeting itself. What participants are there, what the meeting ID is, what what all the stuff related to actually getting that session up and running. Now, beyond that, most applications, whether they're a Skype, a Zoom, or whatever, they initiate some sort of UDP communication to stream the video and the audio, and sometimes that UDP stuff is encrypted, sometimes it is not. For the most part, I think it is encrypted these days. But so the signal plane, though, the control plane, is important because the encryption keys and the sensitive data related to setting up the data plane will be exchanged in the control plane side, and so that stuff's really critically important to protect and protect appropriately. Anyway,
some of the competing projects are Google Meet, which Google announced will be completely free to all users, and actually touted itself as a secure platform for video and voice communication. I don't know if anyone else has looked at the security of Google Meets, which I believe is the evolution from Google Hangouts, which did they develop themselves or acquire from someone else? I don't remember, to be honest with you.
Either.
But
it's Google. Who knows?
It's Google, right? So it's kind of interesting, like, what can Google provide, obviously being a much larger company than Zoom, in terms of the secure kind of video and voice communication?
I have not done a security analysis of Google video conferencing traffic. I don't have the time to do that outside. I don't have hobby time to do that. Although it's worth a look, personally, because it is something that a lot of people do. A lot of people do under a business context as well. Frankly, us included. So is it a concern? Yeah. Is it something that we need to examine or trust? Right, is a question that comes up, right? Because there is there is some blinders that go on with some people, not necessarily security folks. That okay, so it's a Microsoft or a Google. They're the 800-pound gorilla. We can just trust them. I think that's a dangerous route there, right? Because but trust but verify is where I kind of come down on that.
Other stories that we did not cover are in the wiki.securityweekly.com. There was an article about another Stuxnet-style vulnerability found in Schneider electric software, which was interesting. Hackers are dumpster diving for taxpayer data in COVID-19 relief scams. I also believe,
nice.
but I also believe that there are many different style attacks going after unemployment claims in the wake of COVID-19 that should not go ignored as well. And that's a multi-state issue here in the U.S. I'm not sure how that plays out in other countries as well, but attackers certainly taking advantage of many of the different kind of fallout from COVID-19 in many different facets. I have seen it go after the unemployment in many different facets, which is kind of interesting. So also Cisco patched a lot of vulnerabilities, high severity vulnerabilities. I don't know. We can debate high severity vulnerabilities tied into my story number 9 about if CVSS is the right standard for prioritization as well. But this one didn't. You can delete or view files on an ASA or WebVPN or AnyConnect Cisco device, but those files are restored if you deleted them if they reboot the device. So kind of interesting one to look at as well.
Okay.
All right.
Let's wrap it.
Let's wrap it up.
Agreed.
Thanks everyone for listening and watching to this edition of Ball Security Weekly. Larry, take us out.
Take us out, Larry.
Over and out.